Hello, Jim. Welcome to the Transformational Learning Summit.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. And I like to start with this question. What does transformation mean to you?
What immediately comes to mind for me in terms of transformation is Plato's observation that the purpose of education is what he called the enlargement of the soul. It's very important that we understand that learning, training, education is not about the accumulation of knowledge. It is about imagination, and it's about how we enlarge the scope of our understanding and wisdom in relationship to the larger ecological matrix within which we find ourselves. So transformation is the origin point for true learning. And that's why both Plato and Socrates emphasized truth pursued, not truth possessed.
Mhm.
And I think that insight strikes to the heart of what's so desperately wrong with education in every country around the world. It's based on essentially rote memorization of facts that in our world are obsolete by the time you learn them, because human knowledge is doubling, according to many specialists, every 15 to 20 minutes. So we have to reimagine what training is in a hyper-complex world.
Hmm. And I know this is really at the heart of the work that you've been doing with Ubiquity, and I'd love to open up a little bit into what that looks like in practice.
Well, I read a study back in 2010 by IBM, in which they interviewed, if my memory serves me correctly, something like 3,600 students and 1,500 CEOs around the world. And the consensus was that there was not a single educational institution anywhere that was actually preparing young people to navigate through what IBM called an increasingly hyper-complex world. Conclusion that the major institutions are teaching knowledge, and what they need to be taught is what has been commonly referred to as the soft skills. In a hyper-complex world, it's not what you know, it's who you are and how you relate to other people in a creative, compassionate way that is the key ingredient that somehow needs to be cultivated in a student. I had been president of a small graduate school in the Bay Area in California. And when I read that study, I decided it's time for me anyway, as an educator, to found a new university. So we founded Ubiquity University in 2012 that has been flourishing ever since. And I would say that the core of the pedagogy is threefold. Number one, what we call explore, equip, and engage, which, if you think about it philosophically, is Plato's truth, beauty, and goodness.
Mhm.
The essence of education ultimately needs to be founded on a moral bedrock, or the students will lose their way, because knowledge does not enable you to navigate hypercomplexity. It's your internal orientation to the eternal verities that actually give one the navigation skills for the world in which we find ourselves. Number two, we developed what we called the subject-object synthesis. And what that means is that students need to demonstrate that they have command, they have knowledge of the content that they're learning. But equally important, they need to be conversant and express with equal clarity how the content is impacting their lives. How is it contributing to truth, beauty, and goodness in the world? So whether you're doing a post paper, you're doing a PhD dissertation, we're interested in what you know, and we're interested in your personal and spiritual development. And that's what brings together the left brain and the right brain. Because often in expressing your personal development, you move from prose to poetry. And that is a very important aspect of learning in our view. And number three, learning in a world of interconnectivity cannot be exclusively an isolated enterprise. People generally, but I think in particular in this world, need to understand that whoever they are and whatever they're doing in the world, it needs to be of service in an historical situation in which humanity quite literally finds itself on the precipice of self-destruction. And one only needs to look around the world to see how precarious our world condition is. And therefore, learning not only is about remembering who we are, cultivating truth, beauty, and goodness, balancing the left and right hemispheres of the brain with the hard and the soft, but it also needs to be in one way or another helpful in the larger human community.
Mm. Yeah, I resonate with what you're sharing so much. And what I often see in the world is that a learning experience might be specifically about learning soft skills or specifically about learning more technical information. And it's rare that a learning experience invites both, that it invites the practice and cultivation of soft skills in the context of some sort of more technical knowledge endeavor. I'm curious if you could give me a specific example of what that might look like in practice, of how you might approach a more technical subject in a way that invites the practice or cultivation of soft skills.
Well, let me give you an example from Sri Lanka. We had a major project with the Ministry of Education in Sri Lanka a number of years ago. And it was taken in by one of the most eminent of the high-tech universities in Sri Lanka. And they, were purely into STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. And I had a very animated conversation with the rector. And I said, we need to move from STEM to STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And so we did an experiment. And they were learning physics, they were learning trigonometry, they were learning engineering and all of that. And they had one course which was around the soft skills. We did an analysis of all the studies done on soft skills, and we reduced them to 7. And we organized the 7 soft skills in resonance with the 7 chakras, which is really an interesting discussion sometime. The relationship between epistemology and ontology. But I'll just leave that aside for now. We embarked on the class, And at first, most of the students weren't interested. But as they got into the course, they began to realize that they were learning things and having an opportunity to express themselves in ways that they'd never had in their entire lives. And it was a 6-month course. And after 6 weeks, not only were all the students in attendance, but they began to invite their friends in because, again, hard skills. You listen to the teacher, you take notes, you memorize it, and then you regurgitate it. Soft skills, there are no tests. You interiorize what you're learning about the empathy or compassion or respect for diversity or leadership, etc. Not by absorbing information, but by interacting with other people and sharing your experiences. And so what began to happen with these Sri Lankan kids who had never in their lives had the opportunity to sit in a circle and just share who they were, what they were feeling, and how they were, developing in the world. They began to talk more and more and more. Their grades went up in the hard skills. They became more aware socially. They developed a sense of civic virtue that the students, the teachers began to observe, and it began to spread to other schools around Sri Lanka. So that's an example that you can be taking physics perfectly okay. Balance that with soft skill training, because as we all know, the more you balance left and right brains, hemispheres in the brain, the more you do better in your left hemisphere, and the more you do better in your right hemisphere. Because the brain, if trained to act holistically, that's the key to not only better learning, but better health in your body, better relationships with your peers and your family, so that this kind of education, the enlargement of the soul, is transformational, both personally and socially. And it was a wonderful thing to watch. And we see it at Ubiquity. Many times, particularly men come in, and they haven't taken an art course, since the 3rd grade, and here they are writing a PhD dissertation, taking these courses, and they're required to talk about their feelings, talk about their spiritual aspirations. And at first, it's uncomfortable, but once you do it, not only do you expand, you enlarge, but you gain insights back into the left brain. See, content is always connected with context. And if you change the context, how you perceive the content changes. So your appreciation of content in your left brain, you think you understand. But then if you bring your right brain in, all of a sudden you get insights into the content you never had before. So this kind of learning is not, academically interesting. This kind of learning is actually essential for human growth and development. And when you add a world of hypercomplexity in which stresses, chaos, catastrophic system failures, climate disasters are escalating all around us, the most essential task of education, to quote Ilya Prigogine, is to create islands of coherence in a rising sea of chaos. And that can only be done by blending the hard skills and the soft skills and the left brain and the right brain within a spirit of Socratic inquiry, that is focused ultimately on the transformation of the soul.
Hmm. I love that you're pointing to the importance of both content and context, and how, so much of traditional learning is just focused on the content piece without the awareness of the context piece. And I'm curious how you, um, in specifically in the context of online learning and say like an adult developmental, like in a professional development program that Ubiquity might offer, how do you think about that discovery of context, or bringing that into the 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 direct learning experience?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question, the interactivity between content and context. And I think the core learning that I have um, gleaned from this exploration is along the following lines. Oftentimes, we compartmentalize our learning. That's the one of the core foundations of the current educational model. Not only are we in the grip, I would say imprisoned by scientific reductionism
Mm.
and the limitations of the current scientific paradigm, but we're constrained by the physics department having nothing to do with the biology department. And so you go to the hospital and you see an endocrinologist who doesn't know anything about your neurons, and you go to see a urologist who doesn't know anything about nutrition. So what one needs to do in the learning process is constantly expand for the student the relationship between context and content. And that requires being aware of world events.
Mm.
It requires being aware of social and technical developments. If you're in a world where knowledge is doubling every 20 minutes, according to some specialist, what's the point in rote memorization? Because the context is radically outstripping the current pedagogical model. And it's the inability or the refusal of educators to take in this larger context that the world has changed, ladies and gentlemen, and we have to pay attention to that. That is at the heart of our predicament in the current educational model, and why, for example, some business specialists considered Harvard Business School to be between 5 and 10 years obsolete because
Mm.
they lost track of the context. Let me give you a specific example. Since COVID in 2020, 2021, 2022, every category of social, personal stress in every country in the world that's been studied has gone up. There's more addiction, there's more domestic violence, there's more drug abuse, there's more depression, there's more anxiety, particularly among the youth. Polling shows that upwards of 2/3 of the young people in the United States and Europe and internationally believe that basically all is lost. There's nothing that anybody can do to redeem the current global situation. An educator needs to take that in. Why is everybody so stressed? Why is there more road rage? Why are we all just neurotic? Because we can no longer even take in the news. I had talked to an educator several months ago who was talking about headline news post-traumatic stress. People are turning off from even watching the news because everything on the news is one catastrophic event after another. So an educator needs to understand that. So if that's the context, then we need to create coherence. People are not able to learn if they're stressed. So meditation, mindfulness, breathing. How do we just come into equanimity, equipoise, coherence? And in that disposition of being, now, what do you want me to learn? Right? So that's an example of context demanding certain content. And I would say, for example, that at the heart of transformational learning today is mindfulness training. Because we are going to see in 2024 and 2025 and 2026 more turbulence than the human race has ever seen in the history of the world. And everybody needs to take this in. Let me give you an example. Several weeks ago, they convened the 2024 World Economic Forum in Davos. Right before the event, they asked 1,490 specialists in risk management to do a risk analysis of planet Earth. All of them, with virtually no exception, said that we're heading into a global catastrophe within the next 10 years. 500 of them, 1/3 of them, said we're going to experience a global catastrophe within the next 24 months. Climate scientists increasingly are talking about extinction events sometime between 2025 and 2026, because the world is refusing to do anything about climate change. But that doesn't mean it's going to go away. While we're committing genocide in Gaza, while we're wasting lives in Ukraine, while we're in confrontation with China, while we're in constant political and economic and social turmoil, the climate is spinning out of control. We need to take it in. So everybody listening to this little interview needs to take it in that we're heading into turbulence, the like of which humanity's never seen. And we owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our children to understand that this isn't any longer about transformation so that we gain enlightenment and, live happily ever after. We're long past that. We're all headed into Gaza. We're all heading into a world of a turbulence that is going to shake the foundations of human civilization to such an extent that survival is going to be what many people, for the first time in their lives, are going to have to grapple with. And education and training needs to understand that. That's what hypercomplexity is all about. When small events anywhere can reverberate through the global system and have major, unpredictable, catastrophic consequences anywhere else in the global matrix. And when you're in a unified world, particularly with the internet and mass communication, you're in a world in which events in places you've never heard of will directly impact your life in ways that you can't even prepare for. So that's an example of context. And we as educators need to pay attention to that. So you need to be informing people of this context in a realistic way. And you then, therefore, need to be developing the kind of training programs that will enable them, whatever's happening, to maintain presence of mind and a capacity to think strategically in whatever situation in which they find themselves.
I feel like there's so much relevancy in what you're saying in the context of that the human relationship to knowledge is changing so dramatically right now, from the necessity to memorize things to the impossibility of memorizing things to having AI intelligence that can help you access information, you know, within a couple of searches. What is How do you personally grapple with that as an educator? You've got this online university that's flourishing, and you are also being confronted by the reality of the transformation of the process of education itself. So I'm just curious about, what do you consider, maybe what's the challenge that you live with that's the closest one to your heart in this deep, I can feel this deep, honest integrity, this commitment to being in service of the kind of education that human beings need today. What does that mean for you personally?
Well, what it means for me personally is spending more and more time in meditative practice and in coherent breathing. The available teachings of the great mystics going back thousands of years, and the available teachings of the latest scientific understanding of how to generate coherence is through the breath. And I do a lot of coherent breathing practice. And I would just share one practice, and I would refer people who want to know more about this to James Nestor's book, Breath, a New York Times journalist, best-selling book on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time. Breath, it's worth reading, everybody. And you'll find in that book what the mystics have been talking about for thousands of years. And that is a very simple breathing technique. And that is, you breathe in for 5.5 seconds, basically the count of 5, and you breathe out for 5.5 seconds. That gives you 5.5 breaths in a minute, in which you bring in 5.5 liters of air. It's the most perfect way to breathe. If you do that, what it does is it integrates your sympathetic and parasympathetic systems, the most basic systems of your body. It brings coherence between your brain and your heart. And it optimizes all your body systems, right? So that's just a quick example of what I do. You start spending 20, 30 minutes, maybe an hour a day. I do it when I walk. I have a 10-minute walk from my office here in Washington, D.C. To my little apartment. And so when I walk to and fro every day, I do coherent breathing. And you'll be struck that if you start doing just something as simple as coherent breathing, that you feel better, you're more alert, and you're more compassionate because you're more internally coherent. There's a direct relationship between internal coherence and our capacity for compassion, for kindness, for tenderness. If you're all stressed out, at least when I'm all stressed out, I tend to be reactive. When I'm more coherent internally, I'm more relaxed. I can see the bigger picture. I'm more understanding, and I'm more kind. So that's just a quick example, but that's certainly what I do. But I'd like to bring in, if I may, another point before we wrap up, which I think is really important for everybody to take in, who is an educator. And it's along the following lines. Last December, the US Congress passed legislation signed into law by President Biden on December 22nd, on a solstice, as it turned out, mandating that every US government agency and contracting corporations must, beginning this year, to turn over all the evidence that they've gathered over the last 75 years about UFOs to the National Archive of the Library of Congress. That's one reason why I'm in Washington. I continue as president of Ubiquity University, but I'm also the director of the Washington office of the New Paradigm Institute. This is the most momentous moment, in my view, in the history of the human race. We are now being told that there is incontrovertible evidence possessed by the US government and governments around the world that we are not alone, that extraterrestrial intelligences exist. They've been on planet Earth for some time. There's evidence of sustained contact and communication. There are alien craft that have been retrieved. There are extraterrestrial biological entities that have been retrieved. And the human race now is entering what I would say is its ET moment, its extraterrestrial moment. The momentousness of this is almost incalculable because every aspect of who humanity is now going to undergo a radical transformation. And as an educator, Ubiquity University, in partnership with the New Paradigm Institute, has created the first ever extraterrestrial studies program. So students can learn what the facts are about the history, law, politics, and technology of the ET presence on Earth, and also learn who these beings are and how do you communicate with them. As it turns out, the ETs, by all accounts, communicate through mental telepathy. So we're beginning training programs in how you cultivate the faculty of remote viewing, clairvoyance, kinesis, and a variety of other ways of mentally, telepathically communicating. It also turns out that if you can communicate with your pets, your dogs, your cats, people communicate with trees, they communicate, the horse whisperers, people can communicate with interspecies communication. That now needs to be taught. The new mother tongue in an extraterrestrial era is not teaching Greek and Hebrew. It's teaching the mother tongue. How do we learn interspecies communication? How do we learn to communicate with these advanced beings that are appearing on our planet? Right? So this is an example, Lawrence, of two things. Number one, context and content. When your context changes, your content changes. So one of the things that all educators should start to think about is extraterrestrials. What are the implications on learning? What are the implications on theology? What are the implications on energy and technology? How do they even get here? Are they coming from Alpha Centauri? Are they coming in through another dimension, which is happening simultaneously with ours, and we just don't see it? And they're capable of coming in and out. We don't know. We need to find out. Number two, one of the things that has been communicated by the extraterrestrials around the world for the last 75 years since the end of the Second World War is the simple communication to virtually every human that they've interacted with. And that is stop killing each other. Stop destroying the environment. Come into harmony with the ecosystem of your planet. So what we're experiencing right at the moment, where we literally teeter on the brink of self-destruction, the heavens are descending. And intelligences from the larger cosmos are visiting this planet and communicating that not only are we not alone, but the human race needs to now engage in a transformation, the like of which it's never even considered before. And that is to transcend the conflict in which we find ourselves and seem to engage in with such enthusiasm, war, destruction, not only of each other, but of the larger ecosystem, and come into an alignment and discover for the first time our true destiny as ambassadors of planet Earth to the larger cosmic civilizations that are now establishing contact. So there's a lot for educators in this moment to consider on these matters. And it's ultimately around the key question of how humanity is going to transform itself. So what you're doing, Lawrence, with your conference, I just really want to commend you and thank you for everything that you're doing. And if anybody wants to be in contact, please do. Be happy to share on a more granular level with anyone who's interested. But I appreciate this time to dialogue with you.
Thank you, Jim. If you have one takeaway for an educator who, because there's one thing to deal with the concept or the context of civilizational collapse as we're all watching it. It's another to begin to take into account the possibility of alien intelligences on our integrating with humanity. If there was one thing that someone watching this could begin to somehow reflect on or practice or expand into in the context of what they might be, how they might be integrating this into their work, what would you suggest?
Breathe.
Amen.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Jim. Much love to you.